There's been a big shift, in my opinion, from when I joined and it was all down in the dumps to now. It feels a lot more optimistic. A lot more is happening.
I've talked to Roblox studios that are smaller, younger teams that are super happy with how they're monetizing and how they're able to support themselves. But on a venture scale, that's a different question.
Hello and welcome to the Game Business Show. We're a brand new business publication all about the world of video games. If you'd like to hear more about us and to sign up to our newsletter, head to thegamebusiness.com. Now, today's show is all about video games investment. About a year ago for gamesindustry.biz, I wrote an article that looked at how investors were feeling about the games market, and it made for pretty bleak reading. They were predicting a brutal year for the games market, with up to 2 years of pain for video game companies. However, there were some investors that were optimistic about how things might be in 2025. Well, we're a third of the way through that year now. The brutal headlines are continuing and analysts are cautious about growth in the video games market. So how are investors feeling? Is there any sign of light behind these dark clouds? Well, we asked them.
Things definitely picked back up. It's definitely very busy at the moment. We've got 3 deals that we're doing at the minute, which is a bit different to this time last year. This time last year, I think we'd only closed 1. I've only been with LVP for just coming up 2 years now. And there's been a big shift, in my opinion, from when I joined and it was all down in the dumps to now. It feels a lot more optimistic. A lot more is happening.
I definitely think that there was periods of pretty intense doom and gloom. I would say I have seen a little less doom, maybe a little more gloom, but it hasn't been the whole overall thing hasn't felt as heavy.
Pre-seed and seed deals are happening. They're not as easy as they used to be. The valuations are tighter. People are a lot more questioning. Now it is about solid businesses rather than, potential growth. It's, are you creating a business that will be self-sufficient at some point? Are you creating a business that is going to last for a long time and change the games industry? But those deals are happening. And I know we have a lot of bad news at the moment, but there are green shoots around startups, angel deals, early stage VC deals.
You heard there from Gus Curley, who is an associate at London Venture Partners, Kelly Wallach, who is partner at One Up Ventures, and angel investor Nick Button-Brown. And they all seem relatively bullish about the market right now, certainly in contrast to the headlines that we've been seeing. But not everyone is feeling as confident. Alexei Garavarian is the CEO of indie publisher Kepler Interactive and games investments fund Kowloon Knights. And for him, he's not seeing any significant shift in the funding landscape in 2025 compared with 2024.
I think it's really difficult to read the tea leaves at the moment. There is no immediate reason to believe things will dramatically change. I think it's very obvious for everyone that we went from a phase of very rapid expansion with a lot of money flowing through our sector to a much drier patch. And essentially, I think most folks who used to actively invest in our space have kind of stopped. We had a lot of VC money flowing in, and that kind of is non-existent now. We had a lot of the larger investors from China and other regions that were also very active in investing, and that also kind of has stopped. And I think publishers are being incredibly cautious as well. They are not signing as many titles. Budgets tend to be very low, and I think reasonably they're also waiting for things to be very far along before picking them up. And so that really creates a really challenging time for studios, because effectively you need funding to get something off the ground. You need funding to get a project started. I think at the moment, especially for early stage funding, there really isn't a lot of people able to fund things. And I'd say if you go up certain budgets, probably above $1 million, there really aren't that many publishers either who are able to provide capital to develop your projects.
One of the investors I spoke to last year was Spike Lorry, partner at VC firm Hero Capital. Last year, he told me he had hoped to see the games market improve come 2025, at least a little bit. But now he feels that 2025 will be another tough year for video game companies.
Everything is down, right? And especially in the last week, we've seen even more economic uncertainty through the Trump administration's tariffs, and the kind of inevitable kind of trade war that brings with China and with other countries, and a very acrimonious relationship, it looks like, with Canada straight off the bat, right? So in uncertain times when interest rates are kind of high, it takes very, very bold and brave investors to be making speculative bets on things like the games industry, especially as, and we've talked about it many times, a lot of venture capital funds funds and also publishers over the last couple of years had not met the investors' expectations, had not returned cash or capital to their LPs, to their investors. And so we're still in a climate where people with money, who unfortunately are the people that are funding this stuff at the end of the day, would rather put their money in the bank and sit and wait than invest it in video games.
Well, let's dive a little deeper, shall we? According to a report from VC fund Convoy, 2024 saw a big drop in the number of deals being done around video games, and an even sharper fall in the value of those deals. However, the 446 VC deals that were done in 2024 is actually more than the 434 that were done in 2020. So when it comes to the quantity of investments, particularly those early stage investments, we're still seeing growth over pre-pandemic levels. Both Gus Curley and Nick Button-Brown cited this data to me as evidence that there is funding out there, and that's hard to dispute. There are still stories of new game studios receiving funding, certainly not to the level we saw a few years ago, but investments are happening and new teams are emerging. What's challenging is that there are a huge number of games companies fighting over this money. And that means the days are over when developers could receive investment with nothing more than a pretty sales pitch and some mocked up artwork. In fact, many of the investors we spoke to say they need to see something showable, even a prototype, before they'd consider investing. Here's LVP's Gus Curley.
People don't believe that they can really get that much out there for very little. But like what we've sort of seen over the years is I think one of the biggest problems in the industry at the minute is the oversaturation of content and oversupply of content. And that's arguably because the democratization of the tools like Unreal Engine, Unity. Anyone can now create a game, which is very different to before. And that sort of means that we're now looking for these teams that can actually get something out to market, be quite frugal.
Last year, I spoke to Steel City Interactive, the game studio behind the million-selling boxing game Undisputed. The three brothers who formed the company made as much of the game as they could by themselves in their own homes. They even put a car on the line in order to secure some licenses, all before approaching VCs. That meant by the time they went to market looking for investment, they were not short of interested parties. But those brothers were, notably, not games industry people. In fact, they'd never made a game before. They were just entrepreneurial people with a love for video games and a love for boxing. That represents another shift in the investment space. Who is getting the money? During the peak of the pandemic years, I regularly wrote about a former AAA games veteran who worked on Battlefield or Call of Duty or League of Legends or Overwatch, who had secured a multi-million-dollar investment deal to form a new AAA studio. But today, the type of founders the investors are choosing to work with are a lot more conventional.
Everyone has seen a lot of new studios getting started by like well-known veterans and with extremely large budget for their first game. And in our experience, actually, the most successful teams tend to go for something more modest on their first game, try to build up, because it's a really challenging thing, right? If you start a studio, you're building a team, you're building a company, and you're building a video game. And you don't really think about those things when you start. You're like, I have a great idea, I have a concept, I have a thing that I want to make, and I'm going to spend the next 3 to 5 years of my life doing this. But actually, you also have to hire people. They have to get along together. They have to build up a momentum on how you make the thing. Plus, you start having to worry about IT issue, HR, and all the other things that a person running a company has to do. And so the amount of time you spend actually making a functional video game shrinks. That makes it harder to make something really interesting and really good.
I think it's a different type of founder that's being backed now than was before. I think a lot of the companies that got funded in 2020, 2019, 2021 were these founders coming from these massive studios like Riot, EA, who have worked on major franchises. But now I think it's moving to much more scrappy, previous entrepreneurial experience, not necessarily successful by any means, but people who've sort of been through it before and can do it again and not been part of these massive teams, like been part of a small team and actually ship something.
That was Kepler's Garavarian and LVP's Curley effectively saying the same thing there. Now, some of the investors we spoke to say they're wary of investing in a big name developer with a set vision. In fact, they talked about the importance of making games for an audience. For almost 20 years doing this job, a phrase I often hear when I interview game developers is, we just make the games we want to play. Well, in 2025, that isn't a phrase that necessarily goes down with investment groups.
People very, very often create what they want to play, what they want to create. They start a games company not because they want to start a business. They start a games company because they wanted their own. They didn't want to report to the boss anymore. They wanted to build the games they always dreamed to play, which comes with lots of struggle, which comes with people see, don't look around what happens in the market very often. I have so many friends who work in games, and so many times when we talk, I don't want to say I'm shocked, because first of all, they're my friends, and second of all, I really like some of the games they build. But very often they don't look in the market when they decide to build a game. They don't look, is there even a target group for it? Is this big enough? What's the production time? Is there currently a change of platforms coming, so it doesn't make any sense? And that's, I think, where we are very, very different. We look very analytical, very data-driven. And we try to ask as many questions before, but also, and I hate saying that, that's my favorite, one of the favorite things that my co-founder just say, we're financially prudent. We're very careful with when we spend money and how, and we try to educate our teams to do so themselves, because games have become incredibly expensive to build.
That there is Oliver Hines of gaming group Aonic, which has acquired numerous studios in recent years, including Warren Spector's Other Side Entertainment, and late last year secured 152 million euros in funding. And when it comes to data, it's not so much sales figures that he's talking about. When it comes to being analytical, a lot of the time that involves trawling through YouTube comments and reading Reddit threads.
You can read a lot between the lines. You can, if you trailers and you read the comments, you read a lot in them. If you really, really read deep into them and not just see the wow trailers. Very often, if you start reading a lot comments, you start again feeling which are generic and potentially done by, marketing companies, PR companies to boost the trailer. But if you see the longer comments and discussions and the follow-up threads on Reddit, you can get a big feeling of what's working, what's not.
Nick Button Brown goes further, says he likes to invest in companies that are making games in collaboration with the community, getting feedback from them as they're making the game. And he thinks that's critical in order to stand out in today's market.
The big publishers can't bulldoze things to success anymore. There was always, you could get to a certain number of units. If you work the channels, if you got the sign off, if you got the listings, if you did the shows and so on, you could get to a certain number. That's gone. That doesn't happen. You are at the beck and call of the market far more than you were 10 years ago. So that's the companies that are developing things alongside the market, where people are supporting it from early on, where people are evangelizing what they're doing. That's why that's particularly interesting.
We're building a bit of a picture here of what investors are looking for. Investors are backing companies and projects, but in a different way to before. It's not about famous game developers scribbling an idea on the back of a napkin, but frugal entrepreneurs with a prototype, a track record in shipping projects, and the ability to focus on what the audience wants to play, not just what the creators want to create. What surprises me about all this is it sounds almost sensible. Over the years, we've seen investors getting overexcited and spending huge sums of money on whatever the latest industry buzzword just so happens to be, often to disappointing results. VR, Metaverse, Web3, those are all recent examples of sectors that in the past have received a lot of investor attention under the hope that they were going to transform the market. So I asked our panel if there's a hot concept today that's getting investors excited. And the answer I received was almost universal: user-generated content. Now, by user-generated content, what we're talking about here is Roblox, and to a lesser extent, Unreal Editor for Fortnite. These are platforms where developers, whether that's solo creators or entire professional teams, can make games that can potentially reach hundreds of millions of players using the in-game tools. Investors are paying close attention to the games doing well within Roblox. As a platform, Roblox has over 85 million daily active users. To put that into context, it has more users than PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo combined. So investors are backing UGC companies. One such company, Voldex, has been raising millions of dollars from various investment groups, and just last month used some of those funds to acquire the smash hit Roblox game, Brookhaven, which boasts over 120 million monthly active users. However, not every investor is 100% convinced. One Up Ventures has made some investments into UGC companies working within Roblox and Fortnite, but it remains cautious.
There's a lot of like really like young creative developers there and like
yeah.
ideas, and it's kind of like a soup of just like wild experimentation, which is like awesome. Like I love seeing that kind of stuff. And so, if it just ends up being something that it's kind of like the cauldron for like where the next generation of like game developers and game design and all that stuff like comes out of, that's awesome. And I've talked to Roblox studios that are smaller, younger teams that are like super happy with like how they're monetizing and how they're able to support themselves. But on like a venture scale, that's a different question than are you able to like make something that's a hit and, have fun and reinvest back into your studio and make more content and stuff. But then it's like, yeah, like how do you, like, are you able to earn enough to kind of get either out of Roblox or do something that's really going to be like a big hit the way it would be on like PC or console or something like that. And that's still kind of a question mark. It's like there's a lot that's really interesting about it and exciting, but maybe not particularly from like a VC investable angle.
Meanwhile, Hero Capital's Spike Lorry isn't entirely convinced of the economics on the platform.
The UGC space always feels like this mecca opportunity of, because if you can get it right, you can really get it right. Roblox continues to do super well. I think for me, the jury's out on the economics of the Roblox model, just because of how much of a take that Roblox takes from the developers. But it's still obviously a really interesting space. I think UFN was an area where there was a lot of hope, but I don't think that's crystallized, or I don't think that's come to fruition.
But almost all the investors we spoke to are paying close attention to the UGC space. Here's Nick Button-Brown.
On Roblox, you can make a mechanic so quickly, you can test it so quickly, you can find out whether it works, and you can iterate. So they're coming out with just a completely different mentality. We used to think that we fast iterated. They really do fast iterate. Yeah. I mean, they're trying it. They've got a game now. It's worked. It's failed. They're on to the next game within a couple of weeks. The assumption is that you need to break out of it. How do you take it to another space? How do you do it differently? How do you do it? I don't necessarily think that you need to. There are people that are building great careers, great lives, great companies who are making content for Roblox. Can they make content for UEFN? Can they make content for Minecraft? Yeah. But they don't need to deliver a Steam game. They don't need to deliver a console game because their games are already played on PC and console. So that just kind of, I think there is a new generation that have learned to really, really fast iterate on mechanics. And it's going to be really interesting to see the kind of games that they're creating in the next 10 years.
There are other areas outside of UGC that are turning investor heads. Two of the investors we spoke to brought up the return of social network games, specifically tied to the social platforms Discord and Telegram. London Venture Partners tells us that Telegram has an audience size that rivals iOS, whereas there are game developers reaching tens of millions of players through Discord. Investors have been stung by social network games in the past, but they are watching this space as a potential way to reach consumers away from the crowded digital stores such as Steam and iOS. Another recent area of excitement for investors has been artificial intelligence, of course. However, although our investors are excited by the prospect of AI in game creation, they were less enthusiastic when asked if they're actively seeking AI companies or projects to fund. Here's Nick Button-Brown again.
AI was hot, then ceased to be hot, and we're now on kind of second generation AI. But it's not, the AI, there's all about AI dev tools. It's like, well, that kind of crest happened, and people are ending up looking at that going, yeah, but how do you actually make money? And with this realism of the current market, the question is, how are you actually going to make money? So AI is, some VCs are still investing heavily in AI. I'm interested to see what the next generation of AI companies are, where AI is impacting on the content itself.
We've spent a lot of time talking about what investors are spending their money on. But what about the other part of that question? What aren't they spending money on? And when I asked them, they all said the same thing: AAA games.
If a team comes to me looking for $20, $30 million to get to a vertical slice for a AAA game, I'm not the fund, I'm afraid, for you. And actually, the people that were doing those deals have stratospherically crashed out of the market, right? You can think about who those are from a strategic point of view. But a lot of those checks dried up, and that funding isn't coming anymore.
I think the whole topic of AAA, like 100 million plus development cost, I don't think we're interested in that right now, simply because the stress you put on yourself and your team in the current market to have a game where you need to sell 5 million units just to make your money back. I think just it's not what we want right now. It's not what we see is the strong suit in the market right now. I'm sure if you have an established IP, but if you now try to build a AAA IP from scratch, I think that's a very, very strong battle you have to fight, and you need to be prepared that you might lose. There will be still AAA games. I mean, there will be the Assassin's Creed, there will be the Call of Duties, but the Halos, Gears of Wars, but they have the IP, they have the audience, they have the name. Building up something new like that, difficult.
It's very difficult to make a return on a AAA game. If you're building a AAA game and it's going to cost 80 million, then to get the kind of return, which means you can pay money back to the people, you've got to sell 400 million. You've got to sell, and that is a stretch for any level of optimism to, with confidence, say you're going to sell that number of games. So AAA is difficult to raise money for.
You heard from Hero Capital, Aonic and Nick Button Brown there that basically all the investors we spoke to say they're simply not investing in this space, not just because of the sheer costs involved in making these projects and the risks that come with that, but also because player behaviors over the last 2 years suggest that AAA isn't necessarily what they want. Outside of AAA, mobile free-to-play is another space our investors are steering clear of. It's very difficult to succeed in that market when faced with the machines of companies like Supercell and King. However, LVP's Curly says there are some opportunities in mobile, particularly with user acquisition costs flatlining. Now, there's one area of the investment world we've not spoken about at all so far, and that's public companies. And to see how shareholders are feeling about the sector, we spoke to Patrick O'Donnell from investment research firm Goodbody, who specializes in tracking public video game businesses.
There's still a lot of trepidation amongst investors in the video games industry in general, partially because people see a lot more cost pain to come, but also because on top of that, you've got kind of a consumer that's still relatively constrained in terms of spending globally. This is affecting, everything from AAA right down to indie. So, for what we're seeing is it's an incredibly competitive environment out there for publishers and developers. And as such, achieving, a strong momentum on the new release is even harder than ever, as we've seen from the recent Steam stats, which are now at sort of record levels globally in terms of the number of new releases. So despite, a very strong kind of concurrent player base on that platform, it's now more harder than ever to actually to have a commercial success on your title. So what we've seen is that's led to, I think, more stabilized results amongst the publishers in 2024, a slightly better backdrop because we had downgrades last year. We're getting more in line, stroke marginally positively ahead of expectations in the UK, certainly. So that seems to be filtering in the same vein globally, but we're definitely not in a territory of material upgrades or huge sentiment improvements. I think it's very much things are getting incrementally a little bit better, but there's still more pain to come in the sector,
Patrick points to some positives, at least from a financial perspective. The sheer number of layoffs and cost cutting in the sector has helped profit margins, with companies at least delivering in line or ahead of expectations. And also back catalogue sales remain very robust, although it is coming at the expense of new game sales.
When we look at 24, actually, new release was as bad as I've seen it in the 7 years that I've been covering public markets in terms of financial performance right across our publisher base. I mean, we're talking like, the data hasn't been released yet, but we could be looking at 90% plus of revenue coming from back catalogue across the core indie publishers in the UK in 2024. They'll release results in the next few weeks. But from the data that we've pulled through our own company analytics analysis, like it's pretty stark in terms of new release performance.
One thing he notes is that most of the businesses he covers are returning to their core competencies. There's a lot less risk-taking from the major companies. They're instead focusing on the types of games they're known for and have a track record of delivering, as opposed to trying things that's outside of their comfort zone. And that is being generally well received by shareholders. One additional thing he notes is that the low valuation of companies, plus stronger bank balances due to all that cost cutting, could lead to an uptick in mergers and acquisitions towards the back end of the year.
I think we're going to see a flurry of deal flow in 2025, 26. Also, like publishers that won't have the content to get to platforms will need to acquire the content. And there's cash on balance sheets globally now, given the sort of cost cuts that have been done. So it's an important point that M&A is going to be an important part of the firepower for public and private companies, but also for strategics. And then on top of that, you've private equity circling everywhere, given the valuation backdrop in the industry. So I think you've seen CVC come in and buy Jagex in the UK. We expect them to be active again. You've others, like Haveli Group in the US, who are, active with the private division, etc. So globally, there's a lot of capital around, ready to pounce once the right, valuation environment comes to pass.
With public companies playing it safer with established franchises, that does put the onus on the rest of the market to deliver the new things, the innovative stuff, the games we've not seen before. And although investors are cautious, they do know that the games and studios that will succeed today are not the ones delivering things that are already out there. Indeed, Kepler's Gerevarian says his publisher actively seeks games that are radically different to what everyone else is doing.
I don't think safe is safe anymore. I think we see about 1,200 pitches a year. And I think it's natural when you see the sector contract a little bit and less funding, you kind of have a tendency to say, okay, I'm going to pitch something that feels safe. But actually, safe titles don't perform. It's really, really hard. And when we are assessing pitches, our view is always you're trying to throw a can from a movie car 3 hours away from now. And by the time your game is done, the entire space has completely changed. And so making those predictions is incredibly difficult, I think, across the board. Yeah. And so for us, we say, let's just pick games that if they had released 5 years ago or released in 5 years, wouldn't matter. They would be exceptional either way.
So what's the conclusion? Is the investment situation improving in video games? Well, improving might be the wrong word. Investors remain hugely cautious and are no longer spending the levels of money they were just a few years ago. That was the case in 2024, and that is the case today. However, things are crystallizing. There is now more clarity over what investors are looking for. And in many ways, it comes down to what the entire world is being asked to do in 2025, whether that's video games companies or the US government. Can you deliver more, faster, and for less? If you can do that with a good idea, a strong team, and a willingness to work with the market, there is money to be found. I'm going to leave you with wise words from Heroes Laurie, LVP's Curly, and Nick Button-Brown.
Venture capital is looking for outsized returns. You will not make outsized returns making video games in the old tested way, right? Of how to make games. Just the economics don't work. And so, if you're looking for venture capital or for investors, and publishers are different, you shouldn't be approaching them unless you are adapting, pivoting, using the very latest in production technology, really looking carefully at what your consumer wants, looking at the market, creating something innovative and new and disruptive, because that's how you get outsized returns. And I think that's where venture capital can step in and provide very cheap funding to talented people. But if you're just looking to make games, this is how we've always made them, this is how we're going to make them, that's really, you should be talking to a publisher.
I think it's a total new normal. One of our portfolio companies, Bossa, Henry, just released a really good letter. And I think it's people need to adapt to a new environment and not expect the abundance of capital that was flowing in games. We're seeing it with our own studios. Like the terms publishers are giving them are much harsher than what was before. But that's the new normal. Now we need to adapt to that new normal or find new opportunities.
I've heard the survival to 2025, but that's oversimplifying it. That's this idea that the industry is ever going back to where it was 3 years ago. It's not. The survival till 2025 is, but except that the industry has changed. There are elements of the industry. If you're a AAA studio right now, that is a difficult place to be. If you're doing something cool on the cutting edge that's really defining the business, that's an interesting place to be. So it's not survive till 2025. It's recognize that the old business is not where we are now.
Thank you all for listening or watching The Game Business Show. We'll be back later in the week with our news and analysis show. If you want to make sure you don't miss anything and keep up to date on everything going on with us, head to thegamebusiness.com or subscribe to the Game Business newsletter, or indeed follow us on any of the social media channels you like to use. Until next time, thanks for tuning in.